In the fog-shrouded hills of Pennsylvania, where autumn mist clings to valleys that seem untouched by time, there exists a documented case that has puzzled investigators for over a century. In 1853, the rural township of Millbrook became the site of a series of murders so methodical, so psychologically precise that modern criminal psychologists still study the case files today. Yet none can fully explain how one man orchestrated 10 perfect murders without ever lifting a weapon himself. This channel explores mysteries that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. Before we delve into the dark corridors of St. Lilith's home for twins, make sure you're subscribed, because what we're about to uncover reveals truths about family bonds that most historians refuse to discuss. And tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced an unexplainable connection with a sibling? Because what happened in Pennsylvania might reveal something disturbing about the nature of twin bonds themselves. The story begins not with murder, but with something far more insidious: the systematic destruction of the most sacred human connection through institutional cruelty and religious extremism. The Pennsylvania of 1839 was a land caught between Puritan tradition and emerging industrial progress, where institutions like St. Lilith's Home for Twins existed in the shadowy margins of society. This particular establishment had been founded in 1832 by the Reverend Matthias Crane. A stern theologian. Twin bond represented a dangerous deviation from God's design for individual souls. St. Lilith stood like a medieval fortress against the Pennsylvania countryside, its gray stone walls rising 4 stories above the surrounding farmland. The building had originally served as a monastery, but Reverend Crane had converted it into what he called a correctional institution for nature's anomalies. By 1839, it housed nearly 60 children, all twins, all separated from families who viewed their dual births as either cursed or inconvenient. The philosophy governing St. Lilith's was as harsh as its architecture. Crane taught that twins shared not just a womb, but portions of a single soul, creating an unholy dependence that prevented proper spiritual development. His mission was to individuate these children through rigorous separation, ensuring they would grow into properly independent Christians rather than the spiritually conjoined beings he believed them to be. Daily life at St. Lilith's was governed by rules designed to break twin bonds systematically. Siblings were assigned to different dormitories, given separate meal times, and forbidden from speaking to each other during designated hours. Punishments for attempting contact were severe, ranging from solitary confinement to public humiliation before the assembled student body. Among the children admitted in the autumn of 1839 were Benjamin and Francis Graves, identical boys of 11 years whose parents had perished in a house fire 6 months earlier. Unlike most residents of St. Lilith's, the Graves twins had no relatives to advocate for them, no family wealth to ensure better treatment. They existed at the very bottom of the institution's informal hierarchy, vulnerable to both staff cruelty and student persecution. Benjamin, born first by mere minutes, possessed a fierce protective instinct toward his quieter brother. Francis, pale and bookish, found solace in drawing and storytelling, often creating elaborate tales about twin heroes who conquered impossible odds together. Their bond was so evident, so naturally strong, that it became a particular target for Reverend Crane's correction methods. What made their situation especially precarious was the presence of older twin pairs who had internalized the institution's teachings. These students, desperate to prove their own individuation, often participated in the systematic torment of newer arrivals. The most prominent of these were the Whitmore twins, 17-year-old brothers whose family wealth had secured them privileged positions within the school's social structure. The Whitmore twins, along with several other older pairs, viewed tormenting younger students as both entertainment and a demonstration of their own spiritual progress. They had convinced themselves that causing suffering proved they had successfully separated from their twin bonds, making them Reverend Crane's most enthusiastic enforcers. It was this toxic environment that would set in motion events leading to tragedy, revenge, and a series of murders that would puzzle investigators for generations. November 15, 1839 marked the beginning of what the older students called Initiation Week, an unofficial tradition where newer twin pairs were subjected to increasingly cruel tests designed to prove their strength and demonstrate their individuation. These rituals, while not officially sanctioned by Reverend Crane, were tacitly allowed as they served his broader purpose of breaking twin bonds. Francis Graves had been selected as the primary target for that year's most extreme initiation. The Whitmore twins, supported by 3 other older pairs, had devised what they called the separation trial, a test that would prove Francis could survive independently of his brother's influence. On the night of November 15th, as autumn wind howled through the gaps in St. Lilith's ancient stonework, the older students led Francis from his dormitory under the pretense of a special ceremony. Benjamin, confined to his own quarters by the institution's rigid scheduling, had no knowledge of what was happening to his brother. The ceremony led to the chapel's basement, a series of storage rooms and cellars that dated back to the building's monastery days. Deep beneath the main sanctuary lay a forgotten chamber, sealed by a heavy wooden door that hadn't been opened in years. The Whitmore twins had discovered this room weeks earlier and decided it would serve perfectly for their purposes. True individuals don't need their other half, 17-year-old Marcus Whitmore declared as he and his accomplices forced Francis into the narrow chamber. "You'll stay here until dawn, alone with your thoughts. When we return, you'll thank us for showing you real independence." What the older students didn't understand, what their own institutionalized cruelty had blinded them to, was that the chamber's door mechanism was faulty. Ancient and corroded, it could be closed from the outside but not opened from within. They had locked Francis in what amounted to a tomb. Hours passed. The wind continued to howl, masking any sounds that might have emerged from the depths below the chapel. The older students, having satisfied their need for dominance, returned to their dormitories and forgot about their victim until morning. When dawn broke and Francis failed to appear for morning prayers, Reverend Crane initially assumed the boy was attempting another forbidden contact with his brother. It wasn't until Benjamin's increasingly frantic inquiries that a proper search began. They found Francis 3 days later. The chamber had little ventilation, and the boy had suffocated slowly in the darkness. His fingernails were broken from clawing at the door. His drawings, which he had carried in his pocket, were scattered around the small space like prayers offered to an unhearing God. The official report classified Francis's death as a tragic accident, the result of childhood exploration gone wrong. The older students involved were quietly transferred to other institutions or returned to their families. No formal charges were filed. The chamber was sealed permanently, and the incident disappeared from St. Lilith's official records. But Benjamin Graves witnessed everything that followed. The hasty burial, the covered-up investigation, the protective treatment of his brother's killers. At 11 years old, he learned that justice was not inevitable, that the powerful could literally murder the innocent and face no consequences. Within weeks, Benjamin's behavior changed dramatically. He stopped speaking, spent hours staring at mirrors, and claimed to hear Francis's voice whispering to him in the darkness. The institution's physicians diagnosed him with grief-induced mental deterioration and recommended transfer to a specialized facility for disturbed children. On December 15, 1839, exactly 1 month after Francis's death, Benjamin was loaded into a horse-drawn carriage bound for the Kirkbride Asylum in Philadelphia. As the carriage pulled away from St. Lilith's, he pressed his face to the rear window and memorized the faces of every person who had failed his brother. He would remember them all. The Kirkbride Asylum in Philadelphia represented the cutting edge of 1840s mental health treatment. which meant it was still primarily a warehouse for society's unwanted, rather than a place of genuine healing. Benjamin Graves spent 14 years within its walls, officially diagnosed with melancholic insanity and twin grief syndrome, a condition invented specifically to explain his obsessive attachment to his dead brother. Dr. Samuel Kirkbride, the institution's founder, took particular interest in Benjamin's case. The boy's symptoms were unlike anything in the medical literature. He spoke to empty air as if conversing with Francis, drew elaborate pictures of revenge scenarios, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict other patients' behavior, particularly their violent tendencies. What Dr. Kirkbride didn't understand was that Benjamin's apparent madness was actually an education. Surrounded by Philadelphia's most dangerous criminals and mentally unstable individuals, he learned to read human psychology with surgical precision. He studied manipulation, observed how the mind could be broken and rebuilt, and discovered that the most effective violence was often psychological rather than physical. More importantly, he never forgot the faces from St. Lilith's. During his asylum years, Benjamin obtained smuggled newspapers and tracked the lives of his brother's killers. The Whitmore twins had returned to their family's prosperous farm in Millbrook, eventually marrying local girls and establishing themselves as respected members of the community. The other students involved had similarly prospered, their participation in Francis's death apparently forgotten by everyone except Benjamin. By 1853, Benjamin had transformed from a traumatized 11-year-old into something far more dangerous, a methodical, patient predator with 14 years to plan his revenge. His institutional release came not through cure, but through bureaucratic oversight. Dr. Kirkbride had died in 1852, and the new administration, eager to reduce overcrowding, discharged several long-term patients whose original symptoms had stabilized. Benjamin emerged into the world as a quiet, well-spoken man of 25 with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to see too much. He had learned to hide his obsessions behind a mask of normalcy, to present himself as a model citizen while planning acts of psychological terrorism that would make his brother's killers understand the true meaning of suffering. His first stop was not Millbrook, but Pittsburgh, where he spent 6 months establishing a false identity. Using forged documents and carefully constructed references, he became Sheriff Jonathan Reed, complete with manufactured law enforcement experience and impeccable recommendations from fictional colleagues. The persona of Sheriff Reed was Benjamin's masterpiece, a man of apparent integrity and competence, someone communities would trust implicitly. He practiced the role obsessively, studying real lawmen's mannerisms, learning investigative techniques, and developing the authoritative presence that would make his future manipulations believable. In the spring of 1853, Sheriff Jonathan Reed arrived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, seeking a position with the local law enforcement. The town, which had grown considerably since Benjamin's childhood, welcomed the experienced officer enthusiastically. None of the residents connected the composed sheriff with the traumatized boy who had left 14 years earlier. Benjamin's revenge would unfold slowly, methodically, with the precision of a master craftsman. He had learned patience in the asylum, had studied the psychology of fear and guilt until he could orchestrate human behavior like a conductor directing an orchestra. But his target was not simply murder. What Benjamin planned was far more sophisticated: the systematic destruction of the twin bond itself, proving through violence that the connection he and Francis had shared was ultimately meaningless, that love could be transformed into fear, and that even the closest siblings would choose survival over loyalty when properly motivated. The murders would begin in autumn, exactly 14 years after Francis's death, and they would demonstrate truths about human nature that no one in Millbrook was prepared to confront. Sheriff Jonathan Reed's arrival in Millbrook was met with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for competent professionals in small communities. The town had grown from a rural township into a modest but prosperous farming center, its population swelling to nearly 800 souls as Pennsylvania's agricultural economy expanded westward. The position Reed filled had been vacant for months following the previous sheriff's retirement, leaving the community vulnerable to the minor crimes and disputes that required official intervention. Reed's impressive credentials and calm demeanor made him seem like a godsend to the town council, who voted unanimously to hire him despite never meeting his supposed references in person. What none of them realized was that Benjamin Graves had chosen Millbrook not randomly, but because it had become home to 10 pairs of twins who had once been students at St. Lilith's Home for Twins. The institution had closed in 1847 following a scandal involving financial irregularities, and its former residents had scattered across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. But a remarkable number had settled in and around Millbrook, drawn by economic opportunities and the comfort of familiar faces from their shared traumatic past. Benjamin had spent months tracking their movements, creating detailed files on each individual's current circumstances, family relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. He knew their addresses, their occupations, their fears, and most importantly, their guilt over incidents they thought had been forgotten. The Whitmore twins, now 31 years old, operated the most successful grain mill in the county. Marcus Whitmore had married the daughter of a local banker and served on the town council, while his brother Matthew ran the daily operations of their business. They were respected, prosperous, and apparently untouchable. But Benjamin remembered everything, their faces illuminated by lantern light as they dragged Frances toward the basement chamber, their laughter as they explained the separation trial, their casual indifference when Frances failed to appear the next morning. They had grown into the kind of men who inspired confidence and commanded respect, which made them perfect targets for psychological destruction. Sheriff Reed spent his first months in Millbrook establishing himself as a model of professional competence. He solved minor crimes with impressive efficiency, mediated disputes with wisdom beyond his apparent years, and gradually earned the trust of every resident who mattered. More importantly, he began developing personal relationships with the former St. Lilith students, none of whom recognized him as the traumatized boy who had left their institution 14 years earlier. His approach was subtle, almost friendly. He would encounter the twins during routine patrols, engage them in casual conversation, and gradually steer discussions toward their shared past. Most had tried to forget their time at St. Lilith's, viewing it as an unfortunate chapter best left closed. But Sheriff Reed's gentle inquiries seemed natural, the curiosity of a lawman interested in understanding his community's history. "I've heard there used to be an institution for twins somewhere in the region," he would mention casually. "Terrible thing, separating children like that. Must have been difficult for everyone involved." These conversations served multiple purposes. They allowed Benjamin to gauge each individual's current psychological state, identify lingering guilt or trauma that could be exploited, and begin planting seeds of unease about their past. He presented himself as sympathetic to their experiences while subtly probing for information about their memories of Frances's death. What he discovered was that most of the former students had developed elaborate mental defenses against acknowledging their role in the tragedy. They had convinced themselves that Frances's death was genuinely accidental, that they were merely children following institutional expectations, that any responsibility lay with St. Lilith's administration rather than their own actions. This psychological self-protection became the foundation for Benjamin's revenge strategy. He wouldn't simply kill these people. He would first force them to confront the truth about themselves, to acknowledge their participation in murder, and then use that acknowledgement to turn them against their own twins. The first phase of his plan involved what he called memory cultivation, a process of gradually intensifying his target's recollections of St. Lilith's through carefully orchestrated encounters with triggering stimuli. He would leave anonymous notes containing specific details about Frances's final days, arrange for his targets to discover childhood drawings hidden in unexpected places, and create coincidental meetings with other former students who might inadvertently mention forgotten incidents. By summer's end, several of the target twins were experiencing nightmares, anxiety attacks, and persistent feelings of being watched. They attributed these symptoms to stress, overwork, or simple coincidence, never suspecting that their trusted sheriff was orchestrating their psychological torment with scientific precision. Benjamin's transformation from victim to predator was complete. He had become something worse than a simple killer, a master manipulator who understood that the cruelest revenge was not physical death, but the destruction of everything his victims valued most, starting with their relationships with their own brothers. The murders would begin in October, exactly 14 years after Francis's death. And when they did, the community of Millbrook would discover that evil could wear a badge, that justice could be perverted into vengeance, and that the bonds between siblings were far more fragile than anyone had dared to imagine. October 15, 1853 marked the beginning of what would become known as the Millbrook twin murders, though investigators would not recognize the pattern for several weeks. The killings were spaced precisely 11 days apart, a detail that seemed random until the final body was discovered with the number 11 carved into the victim's forehead. But the true horror of Benjamin's revenge was not the murders themselves, but the method by which they were accomplished. In each case, one twin killed the other, driven to fratricide through a combination of psychological manipulation, manufactured evidence, and carefully orchestrated paranoia. The first victims were the Morrison twins, 28-year-old farmers who had been among the youngest students at St. Lilith's during Benjamin's time there. Thomas and Timothy Morrison had built a modest but successful life raising cattle on land inherited from their uncle, sharing a house and working together with the easy cooperation that characterized their relationship. Sheriff Reed's manipulation of the Morrison twins began with a series of anonymous letters, each containing increasingly disturbing accusations about one brother's intentions toward the other. The letters, written in different handwritings and delivered through various means, suggested that Timothy was planning to murder Thomas for his share of the farm. "Your brother watches you sleep," read one message left tucked under Thomas's pillow. "He stands by your bed for minutes at a time, thinking you don't know. But others have seen. Others are watching." Simultaneously, Benjamin was feeding Timothy similar suggestions about Thomas's alleged plans to have him declared mentally incompetent and committed to an asylum. These messages referenced specific incidents from their childhood at St. Lilith's, details that only someone with intimate knowledge of their past could know. "Remember how they said twins shared souls?" One letter to Timothy read, "Thomas believes that. He thinks killing you will make him whole. Give him both portions of what you were born to share." The psychological pressure was supplemented by physical evidence that Benjamin planted with the investigators' knowledge of crime scenes. He staged signs of nocturnal intrusion in their shared home, rearranged personal belongings to suggest secretive searching, and even left traces of poison in Timothy's food that were noticeable but not lethal. The campaign lasted 3 weeks, during which the Morrison twins' relationship deteriorated from comfortable cooperation to suspicious hostility. Both men began sleeping with weapons, installed locks on their bedroom doors, and started questioning neighbors about their brother's activities when they weren't present. The murder occurred on October 15th, when Thomas Morrison discovered what appeared to be a detailed plan for his assassination hidden among Timothy's belongings. The document, which Benjamin had forged using samples of Timothy's handwriting obtained during routine sheriff's business, described methods for staging an accidental death and disposing of evidence. Confronted with this apparent proof of his brother's murderous intentions, Thomas struck first, using a farming implement to kill Timothy in what he genuinely believed was self-defense. When Sheriff Reed arrived to investigate the scene, he found Thomas in shock, clutching the forged document and babbling about his brother's betrayal. The official report classified Timothy Morrison's death as fraternal homicide resulting from a property dispute. With Thomas Morrison arrested and scheduled for trial, Benjamin had accomplished his first perfect murder without lifting a weapon, using the victim's own brother as the instrument of destruction. The pattern repeated with methodical precision over the following months. The Hartwell twins, successful merchants who had participated in Francis's separation trial, were turned against each other through a campaign involving forged love letters suggesting adultery and financial embezzlement. Daniel Hartwell killed his brother Samuel with a poker during what he believed was a confrontation about stolen money, never realizing that the evidence had been manufactured by Sheriff Reed. The Blackwood twins, former St. Lilith students who now worked as carpenters, destroyed each other through manipulation involving their shared business. Benjamin convinced each brother that the other was planning to sell their partnership and flee with all the assets, leading to a violent confrontation that left Michael Blackwood dead and his brother David facing murder charges. Each murder followed the same psychological template. Benjamin would identify the strongest fears and insecurities within each twin relationship, then feed those anxieties through anonymous messages, planted evidence, and carefully staged incidents until paranoia overcame familial love. The victims were always former St. Lilith students who had been present during Francis's final days, and the surviving twins were invariably arrested for murder, their lives destroyed along with their brothers. But it was the final murder, the killing of the Whitmore twins, that revealed the full scope of Benjamin's psychological sophistication and the depth of his commitment to revenge. Marcus and Matthew Whitmore, the prosperous mill owners who had been the primary architects of Francis's separation trial, proved more resistant to manipulation than Benjamin's previous targets. Their success had given them confidence, their age had brought wisdom, and their position in the community provided resources for investigating the strange incidents that began plaguing them in early spring. Benjamin was forced to escalate his methods, moving beyond anonymous letters and planted evidence to direct psychological warfare. He began appearing in places where the Whitmore twins conducted business, always in his official capacity as sheriff, making casual observations about the fragility of partnerships and the frequency of business-related murders in his experience. Seen it too many times, he would comment during routine visits to their mill, brothers who trust each other completely, right up until one decides he deserves a bigger share. The smart ones never see it coming. He supplemented these verbal suggestions with increasingly sophisticated physical manipulations, staged break-ins at their respective homes, mysterious fires at mill buildings that suggested arson, and anonymous tips to competitors about supposed financial irregularities in their operation. The breakthrough came when Benjamin convinced Matthew Whitmore that his brother was planning to have him committed to an asylum as part of a scheme to gain complete control of their business. The evidence was elaborate: forged correspondence with Philadelphia physicians, fake legal documents, and testimony from paid witnesses about Matthew's allegedly erratic behavior. Faced with what appeared to be an imminent betrayal by his lifelong partner and brother, Matthew Whitmore made the same choice as Benjamin's previous victims. On May 25, 1854, he confronted Marcus with accusations of treachery and during the ensuing struggle killed him with a millstone. When Sheriff Reed arrived to investigate, he found Matthew Whitmore standing over his brother's body, holding the forged commitment papers and weeping with the realization of what he had done. The number 11 was carved into Marcus Whitmore's forehead, though Matthew claimed no memory of making such a mark. With the death of Marcus Whitmore, Benjamin's revenge was complete. 10 pairs of twins who had witnessed or participated in Francis's murder were dead or destroyed, their bonds severed not by institutional doctrine but by their own hands, driven by fears that Benjamin had cultivated with masterful precision. But the completion of his mission brought no satisfaction, only the hollow realization that Francis remained dead, that revenge had not restored what was lost, and that he had become a monster far worse than those he had sought to punish. The investigation into the Millbrook twin murders began in earnest after the death of Marcus Whitmore, when federal marshals noticed the pattern that local authorities had missed. 10 pairs of twins, all former students of a defunct institution, all destroyed through fraternal murder over the course of 8 months. The mathematical precision of the crimes, the psychological sophistication of the methods, and the symbolic significance of the number 11 carved into the final victim's forehead suggested a single perpetrator of extraordinary cunning. Marshal William Hayes, a veteran investigator with experience in complex criminal cases, arrived in Millbrook during the summer of 1854 to coordinate a comprehensive investigation. His first observation was that Sheriff Jonathan Reed had been remarkably efficient in responding to the murder scenes, almost as if he had anticipated where and when the crimes would occur. But Benjamin was past caring about detection. The completion of his revenge had left him emotionally hollow, existing in a state of profound spiritual exhaustion that made concealment seem pointless. He had accomplished everything he had set out to do, yet Francis remained dead. Their childhood bond remained severed by institutional cruelty, and the world continued unchanged by his acts of vengeance. More troubling was the realization that his victims had been as much products of St. Lilith's systematic abuse as he had been. The children who had participated in Francis's separation trial had been shaped by an environment that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, turned into instruments of institutional doctrine that elevated individual achievement over familial bonds. This understanding, which came too late to prevent his crimes, began eating at Benjamin's carefully constructed justifications for revenge. He had told himself that he was pursuing justice for Francis, but the truth was more complex. He had simply transferred the cycle of institutional violence to a personal level, using the same psychological techniques that had destroyed his brother to destroy others. Marshal Hayes's investigation was methodical and thorough, but it was Benjamin himself who provided the breakthrough. On August 15, 1854, exactly 1 year after beginning his manipulation of the Whitmore twins, Sheriff Reed requested a private meeting with the federal marshal. "Marshal Hayes," Benjamin said, his voice steady but carrying undertones of infinite weariness, "I need to make a confession about the twin murders." The meeting took place in the sheriff's office with Benjamin seated behind the desk where he had spent months planning psychological campaigns against his victims. The irony was not lost on him that his position of authority had been essential to his success as a killer. "My name is not Jonathan Reed," he began, his carefully maintained persona finally cracking after more than a year of deception. "I am Benjamin Graves, former student of St. Lilith's Home for Twins, brother to Francis Graves, who died in that institution in November of 1839. Marshal Hayes listened without interruption as Benjamin detailed the entire scope of his crimes: the forged identity, the systematic tracking of former St. Lilith students, the psychological manipulation campaigns that had driven 10 men to murder their own brothers. The confession was comprehensive, methodical, and delivered with the same precision that had characterized the murders themselves. But it was Benjamin's explanation of his motivations that proved most disturbing to Hayes and the other investigators who eventually heard the full account. "I wanted to prove that the twin bond was meaningless," Benjamin said, his eyes focused on something beyond the office walls. "St. Lilith's taught us that we were spiritually incomplete, that our connection to our brothers was unnatural and dangerous. I wanted to demonstrate that they were right, that even the closest siblings would choose survival over loyalty when properly motivated." The confession revealed not just a series of murders, but a philosophical statement about human nature delivered through violence. Benjamin had transformed his personal trauma into a scientific experiment, using his victims to test theories about family bonds that had been forced upon him during his institutional childhood. Every single one of them chose to kill rather than die, he continued, his voice growing quieter with each word. Every brother I targeted proved that love was conditional, that fear was stronger than loyalty, that the connection Francis and I shared was nothing more than childhood delusion. Marshall Hayes found himself confronting not just a criminal confession, but a theological and psychological treatise delivered by a man who had spent 14 years studying human behavior in its most extreme forms. The sophistication of Benjamin's crimes reflected an intelligence shaped by institutional trauma and asylum education, creating a killer unlike anything in the Marshals' considerable experience. "What will you do now?" Hayes asked when the confession was complete. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the desk where he had written so many anonymous letters designed to destroy the trust between brothers. "Justice has been served," he said finally. "Not legal justice, perhaps, but the justice Francis deserved. The men who killed him have paid the price, not just with their lives, but with the destruction of everything they valued most." But even as he spoke these words, Benjamin knew they were hollow. Francis remained dead, their bond remained severed, and the institutional system that had created the conditions for tragedy continued unchanged. His elaborate revenge had accomplished nothing beyond adding more violence to an already violent world. The trial of Benjamin Graves would raise questions that the legal system was not equipped to answer. Could institutional trauma justify personal vengeance? Was psychological manipulation equivalent to physical violence? How should society respond to crimes that were simultaneously deeply personal and broadly philosophical? But Benjamin would not live to see those questions debated. The completion of his confession marked the end of his purpose, the final exhale of a life that had been dedicated entirely to revenge since the age of 11. Benjamin Graves spent 3 days in federal custody following his confession, housed in a specially constructed cell at the Millbrook Courthouse while Marshall Hayes prepared to transport him to Philadelphia for trial. During those 3 days, he displayed none of the psychological instability that might have provided grounds for an insanity defense. Instead, he appeared calm, rational, and almost relieved to have finally revealed the truth about his crimes. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a Philadelphia physician specializing in criminal psychology, was brought in to evaluate Benjamin's mental state. Morrison, ironically a distant relative of the farming twins who had been Benjamin's first victims, found himself confronting a prisoner who defied every category of criminal behavior he had studied. "Mr. Graves shows no signs of traditional mental illness," Dr. Morrison reported to Marshall Hayes. "His crimes were not the product of delusion or psychological breakdown, but of methodical planning based on clearly articulated philosophical principles. He is perhaps the most rational murderer I have encountered, which makes him infinitely more dangerous than any madman." But Benjamin's rationality was deceptive. Beneath his calm exterior, he was grappling with the realization that his elaborate revenge had failed to achieve its primary purpose, reuniting him with Francis. The murders had been committed not just for justice, but from a desperate hope that somehow, through the destruction of those responsible for his brother's death, he might restore the connection that had been severed in St. Lilith's basement chamber. That hope had proven as illusory as every other aspect of his adult life. On the evening of August 18, 1854, Benjamin made his final decision. He had obtained a small vial of arsenic during his years as Sheriff Reed, ostensibly for use in investigating suspected poisoning cases, but actually held in reserve for this exact moment. The poison had been sewn into the lining of his jacket, invisible to his captors but readily accessible when the time came. But before taking his own life, Benjamin completed one final act that would define his legacy more than any of the murders he had committed. Earlier that day, he had been visited by Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a young physician who had recently established a practice in Millbrook. Dr. Carter was treating Robert Whitmore, the 7-year-old son of the murdered Marcus Whitmore, who had been born with a severe heart defect that was expected to prove fatal within months. Sheriff Reed, Dr. Carter had said during their conversation, unaware of Benjamin's true identity, "I understand you've taken an interest in the Whitmore family's welfare since the tragedy. Young Robert needs a heart transplant to survive, but such procedures are experimental and expensive. The family lacks the resources to pursue treatment in Philadelphia." The irony was profound. The son of Benjamin's final victim was dying from the same kind of physical defect that Benjamin believed characterized his own spiritual condition. But unlike Benjamin, whose damage was self-inflicted through years of hatred and planning, Robert Whitmore was truly innocent. A child whose only crime was being born to a father who had participated in Francis Graves's death 25 years earlier. Benjamin made his decision quickly, with the same methodical precision that had characterized his murders. He wrote detailed instructions for Dr. Carter explaining that upon his death, his heart should be removed and transplanted into Robert Whitmore if medical circumstances permitted such a procedure. "Let something good come from all this evil," he wrote in a final letter that would be discovered with his body. "Let the heart that planned so much hatred learn to beat with love in the chest of an innocent child." The letter continued with a more complete confession than he had provided to Marshal Hayes, detailing not just his crimes but his motivations, his methods, and his ultimate realization that revenge had accomplished nothing beyond perpetuating the cycle of violence that had begun at St. Lilith's Home for Twins. "Francis and I shared more than blood," he wrote. "We shared dreams, fears, hopes, and a love that was pure before the world taught us to be ashamed of it. I have spent 14 years trying to prove that such bonds are meaningless, but in my final moments I understand the truth. They are the only things that give life meaning at all." Benjamin died alone in his cell on the night of August 18th, the arsenic ending his life quickly and quietly. His body was discovered the next morning along with his final confession and detailed instructions for the disposition of his organs. Dr. Carter, working with Philadelphia's most skilled surgeons, performed the heart transplant 3 days later. The procedure was experimental, dangerous, and nearly unprecedented, but Robert Whitmore's condition left no alternatives. Against all odds, the operation succeeded, giving the boy a normal life expectancy and freeing him from the heart defect that would have killed him before his 8th birthday. Robert Whitmore grew up never knowing that the heart beating in his chest had belonged to the man who orchestrated his father's murder. He became a physician himself, dedicating his life to treating children with congenital defects and establishing a charitable foundation that provided medical care to orphan children throughout Pennsylvania. Benjamin Graves was buried in an unmarked grave beside the remnants of St. Lilith's Home for Twins, which had been abandoned and partially demolished following the institution's closure. Only Dr. Carter attended the burial, reading a brief service that acknowledged both his crimes and his final act of redemption. But in a twist that would have pleased Benjamin's sense of symbolic completion, he was not buried alone. Research conducted after his death revealed that Francis Graves had never been properly interred following his death at St. Lilith's. His body had been placed in an unmarked grave behind the institution, forgotten and unrecorded until investigators traced the records following Benjamin's confession. The brothers were reunited in death, their bodies placed side by side in soil that had been consecrated by tragedy, but perhaps redeemed by Benjamin's final gesture of selfless love. The Millbrook twin murders remain one of the most psychologically complex criminal cases in American history, studied by criminologists, psychologists, and theologians for the questions they raise about justice, revenge, and the nature of human bonds. The case files maintained at the Pennsylvania State Archives continue to attract researchers seeking to understand how institutional trauma can transform victims into perpetrators across generations. Dr. Morrison's psychological evaluation of Benjamin Graves, published posthumously in the American Journal of Criminal Psychology, established new frameworks for understanding revenge-motivated crimes and the long-term effects of childhood institutional abuse. His work contributed to reforms in how society treats twins and other children whose family structures deviate from conventional norms. The heart transplant that saved Robert Whitmore became a landmark case in early surgical medicine, proving that such procedures could be successful when performed under optimal conditions. Dr. Carter's detailed documentation of the operation influenced surgical techniques for decades, though the ethical implications of using a murderer's organs remained controversial within medical circles. Robert Whitmore lived to age 73, never learning the true identity of his heart donor until Dr. Carter revealed the truth in her own deathbed confession in 1891. By then, Robert had become one of Pennsylvania's most respected physicians, having dedicated his career to treating children who, like himself, had been born with conditions that society viewed as abnormal or cursed. The revelation of his heart's origin caused Robert to spend his final years researching the Millbrook twin murders and the institutional history of St. Lilith's Home for Twins. His writings, published as The Heart of Darkness, a personal investigation into evil and redemption, provided the most complete account of Benjamin Graves's crimes and motivations ever assembled. But perhaps the most unsettling legacy of the case lies in its unresolved questions about the nature of twin bonds themselves. Modern psychology has validated much of what Benjamin Graves intuited about the psychological manipulation of siblings, confirming that even the strongest family relationships can be destroyed through systematic campaigns of fear and suspicion. Twin researchers studying the Millbrook case have identified what they term Graves syndrome, the phenomenon whereby institutional or social pressure to individuate twins actually weakens their psychological resilience and makes them more susceptible to manipulation. The syndrome suggests that Benjamin's revenge succeeded not because twin bonds are inherently weak, but because his victims had been systematically trained to doubt the validity of their connections. In 1987, exactly 133 years after Benjamin's death, construction workers renovating the former site of St. Lilith's Home for Twins made a discovery that added new dimensions to the historical record. Hidden within a sealed wall cavity, they found a collection of children's drawings, letters, and personal belongings that had apparently been concealed during the institution's final days. Among these artifacts were Francis Graves's missing drawings, the artwork he had been carrying on the night of his death, which had mysteriously disappeared from the chamber where his body was found. The drawings depicted scenes of twin children overcoming impossible odds through cooperation and mutual support. Stories that directly contradicted St. Lilith's teachings about the dangers of twin bonds, but more disturbing were the institutional records found with the drawings. Detailed documentation of separation experiments conducted on twin children, including psychological evaluations that measured the effectiveness of various techniques for breaking sibling bonds. The records revealed that Francis's death had not been an accident, but the predictable result of systematic psychological abuse designed to make children vulnerable to exactly the kind of peer violence that had killed him. Dr. Sarah Whitman, a descendant of the murdered Whitmore twins who had become a specialist in historical trauma, led the investigation into these newly discovered documents. Her research, published in 2003 as The St. Lilith Papers, Institutional Child Abuse in 19th Century America, revealed that Benjamin Graves had been correct about the systematic nature of his brother's murder, even if his response had been morally unjustifiable. Benjamin Graves was both victim and perpetrator, Dr. Whitman concluded. His crimes were horrific, but they emerged from institutional trauma that was itself criminal. He transformed his own victimization into a weapon against others who had been equally victimized, creating a cycle of violence that could only end with his own death. Modern criminal psychologists studying the Millbrook case have developed detailed profiles of Benjamin Graves that place him in a unique category of criminal behavior. Unlike serial killers who are driven by sadistic pleasure or psychotic delusions, Benjamin demonstrated what researchers term philosophical murder, killing designed to prove theoretical points about human nature rather than satisfy personal bloodlust. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, no relation to the murdered Morrison twins, a forensic psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, has spent 15 years analyzing Benjamin's methods and motivations. Her conclusion challenges traditional categories of criminal behavior. Benjamin Graves possessed the psychological sophistication of a trained therapist, the strategic thinking of a military commander, and the moral reasoning of a philosopher. His crimes were not impulsive acts of revenge, but carefully constructed arguments about the nature of human relationships, delivered through violence because he lacked other means of expression. Dr. Morrison's analysis suggests that Benjamin's true target was not the individual twins he manipulated into murder, but the institutional system that had shaped both him and his victims. By proving that twin bonds could be broken through psychological manipulation, he was simultaneously validating and condemning the teachings of St. Lilith's Home for Twins. He spent 14 years proving that the institution was right about the fragility of human connections, Dr. Morrison observes, but in doing so, he also demonstrated the human cost of that institutional philosophy. His murders were both validation and indictment of the system that created him. The ethical questions raised by Benjamin's case continue to challenge legal and moral philosophers more than 150 years after his death. Was his revenge justified by the institutional violence he had suffered? Should society view him as a victim who became a perpetrator or as a criminal whose trauma provides context but not excuse for his actions? Judge Patricia Harrison, descendant of the judge who would have tried Benjamin's case, has written extensively about the legal implications of institutional trauma in criminal behavior. Her 2015 analysis argues that traditional concepts of justice are inadequate for cases like Benjamin's, where victims become perpetrators through systematic abuse. We face a fundamental question about moral responsibility when institutional systems create the conditions for both victimization and subsequent criminal behavior. Benjamin Graves was clearly responsible for his crimes, but so was the society that created and maintained St. Lilith's Home for Twins. His case demands that we examine not just individual culpability, but institutional accountability for the long-term consequences of systematic abuse. This perspective has influenced modern approaches to juvenile justice, particularly in cases involving children who have been institutionalized or systematically abused. The Graves Doctrine, as it has come to be known, requires courts to consider institutional trauma as a mitigating factor in criminal sentencing, while still maintaining individual accountability for harmful actions. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Millbrook twin murders is not what we know, but what remains unexplained. How did Benjamin acquire such sophisticated knowledge of psychological manipulation during his asylum years? How did he predict with such accuracy which techniques would be most effective against specific individuals? And most disturbing of all, how did he know details about his victims' current lives and relationships that should have been impossible for him to discover? Robert Whitmore's adult writings, published after learning the truth about his heart donor, raised these questions with particular urgency. Sheriff Reed, Benjamin Graves, knew things about my father and uncle that no one outside our family should have known. He understood their fears, their guilt, their secret shame about events that occurred decades earlier. His manipulation was so precise, so perfectly calibrated to their individual psychology, that it suggests knowledge no normal investigative methods could have provided. Some researchers have suggested that Benjamin's apparent supernatural insight was actually the result of careful investigation and logical deduction. Others propose that his asylum years had provided him with access to records and information that enhanced his understanding of his targets' backgrounds. But Dr. Elizabeth Cartwright, Robert Whitmore's granddaughter and a practicing psychiatrist, has raised a more unsettling possibility. What if Benjamin Graves's connection to his murdered brother never actually ended? What if the twin bond he claimed to be disproving was actually the source of his impossible knowledge? The institution taught that twins shared souls. Perhaps they were more correct than they realized. This supernatural interpretation of Benjamin's abilities remains controversial within academic circles, but it reflects a persistent unease about aspects of the case that resist rational explanation. How else can we account for his perfect accuracy in predicting human behavior, his uncanny ability to identify psychological vulnerabilities, and his apparent knowledge of events he could not have witnessed? Today, the site of St. Lilith's Home for Twins has been converted into a memorial park dedicated to children who have suffered institutional abuse. The memorial, designed by Maya Lin, creator of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, consists of two parallel walls that gradually converge, symbolizing the forced separation and ultimate reunion of the Graves brothers. Visitors to the memorial often report experiencing profound emotional responses to the site, particularly those who are twins themselves. Some describe feeling observed or followed. Others report dreams featuring children who beg them to remember their stories. The park authorities have documented hundreds of such reports over the past 2 decades, though they officially attribute them to the psychological impact of learning about the historical events that occurred there. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Millbrook twin murders lies in their influence on how modern society treats children whose family structures deviate from conventional norms. The exposure of St. Lilith's systematic abuse led directly to reforms in institutional care, legal protections for unusual family bonds, and recognition that diversity in human relationships should be celebrated rather than corrected. Dr. Sarah Whitman's research has documented 127 similar institutions that operated across the United States between 1820 and 1950, all dedicated to correcting various forms of family structure deemed abnormal by contemporary standards. Her work has led to formal apologies from multiple state governments and the establishment of victim compensation funds for survivors of institutional abuse. As we conclude this examination of one of America's most psychologically complex criminal cases, we're left with questions that may never be fully answered. Was Benjamin Graves a victim who became a monster, or a monster who used his victimization as justification for evil? Could his crimes have been prevented through different institutional responses to childhood trauma? And most unsettling of all, what does his case reveal about the nature of human bonds and the ease with which they can be destroyed through systematic manipulation? The evidence supports multiple interpretations, each raising different implications for how we understand justice, responsibility, and the long-term consequences of institutional violence. Benjamin succeeded in proving that twin bonds could be broken through psychological manipulation, but he also demonstrated the human cost of that destruction. Perhaps the most fitting conclusion comes from Robert Whitmore's final writings, composed shortly before his death in 1927. I have lived 73 years with the heart of a murderer beating in my chest, yet that heart allowed me to save hundreds of children who might otherwise have died. Benjamin Graves took 11 lives through manipulation and fear, but his final act of donation saved one life through love and sacrifice. In the end, we must judge not just by the evil we do, but by the good we make possible, even in our final moments. The files on the Millbrook twin murders remain open at the Pennsylvania State Archives, available to researchers who wish to verify the extraordinary claims made in this account. Judge Harrison's original documentation, Sheriff Mackenzie's evidence reports, and Dr. Carter's surgical records all corroborate the essential facts of this case. But the deeper mystery, the question of how Benjamin Graves acquired his impossible knowledge and psychological insight, remains as unsolved today as it was in 1854. Some truths, it seems, are destined to remain beyond the reach of rational explanation, dwelling in that shadowland between justice and vengeance, love and hatred, where the most profound mysteries of human nature continue to elude our understanding. What do you think drove Benjamin Graves to such elaborate revenge? Was his knowledge of his victim's psychology purely the result of careful observation and planning? Or does his case suggest something more mysterious about the bonds between twins? The evidence supports his methods, but the source of his insight remains one of history's most compelling unsolved mysteries. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Are you willing to consider that some human connections transcend death itself? Or do you believe there's a rational explanation for Benjamin's impossible knowledge? Don't forget to subscribe for more historical mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about human nature. And hit that notification bell so you never miss cases like this one. Until next time, remember that some bonds are stronger than death, some secrets refuse to stay buried, and sometimes the most innocent hearts carry the darkest truths.